It is said that there are some topics you should avoid at the dinner table when wanting to prevent screaming matches, family feuds, wrecked relationships, or even broken marriages. Better to discuss the weather, how it's too hot, cold, rainy, windy, snowy for the season, rather than starting a conversation about politics or religion. In 19th century France, this was particularly true. This was a country settling in the aftermath of a revolution and the birth of the Third Republic. France was still looking for the best form of government that would embody the revolutionary principles. In a country where the quasi-majority of its citizens were Roman Catholic, where the church played a dominant role, it was inevitable that there would be clashes over issues like education, the supremacy of the church, and other related topics. Today's podcast is about the church trying to protect its reputation, a press willing to unearth dirty little secrets, while in the background, a nation was trying to shed its links to an institution which had been omnipresent since its birth. In March 1875, two men gain entry to Mr. Albar's house. He is a priest who lives with his unmarried sister and his young nephew, the son of another sister. They physically assault the priest and his sister, but while both men are distracted, the woman manages to flee to safety to a neighbour's house. Once assured that the two men have left, the alert is raised. It is too late for Mr. Albar, who lies dead in his bedroom. The house has been ransacked and an important sum of money is missing. The procurer and the judge of instruction travel to the small town and launch an investigation. The wounds received by Albar's sister and the bloodstains on her clothing seem to be from being the aggressor rather than the victim. In June 1875, Julie Albar and two handymen, the Serins, a father and son, are charged and jailed for murder and burglary. After several months of the prosecution trying to build a case, they come to the conclusion that there is no substantial evidence that the prisoners are the murderers. Therefore, the three suspects are released. Years pass, and the crime remains unresolved. However, 9 years later, in 1884, a newspaper called The Lantern reopens the case, claiming to have new evidence and even gives the name of the murderer. Some would think that the murder of Mr. Albar was a banal event, like others that sadly existed everywhere across the country. The Lantern, however, after a lengthy investigation, had uncovered a scandal of epic proportions. The newly accused murderer is a priest, and to compound his wickedness, he is a multi-recidivist, a serial offender, currently enjoying the protection of the church. The murder of Mr. Albar is actually part of a pattern of criminal behaviour, starting with petty thefts to rape and even murder. What makes the accusation from the Lantern newspaper more shocking is that the religious authorities were aware of the criminal activities and they helped him to cover them up by turning a blind eye, or when necessary, by impeding any external action against the wayward priest. The printed publication of the revelations caused an outcry among French citizens. Some accused the church of being more concerned of its reputation rather than doing the right thing. Others are horrified by the crimes and the lack of retribution. People shout that this again proves the church is up to no good and must be eradicated. On the other hand, the Catholic press cries to defamation and fabrication. They try their utmost to convince the public that the newspaper is lying or exaggerating the facts. The first article published by The Lantern in January 1884 set the tone. Its title was The 30 Crimes of Bude. Then the newspaper laid down its discoveries for the public scrutiny. Toussaint Cyprien Bude was born in 1832 in Aveyron in the south of France. First, he joined the seminary of Rodez, close to where he was born, but he leaves after a series of thefts. Then he moves on to the seminary of Périgueux, further west, possibly hoping to start over without suspicion. Again, he leaves the community after committing several petty crimes. Then he moves around, joining several communities but never fitting in. In 1860 or 1861, he travels to Italy and is ordained as a priest. In 1863, he lived in a community of Italian priests in Marseille, back in the southeast of France. He was unable to get his own parish due to his reputation, so Bude stole the notes from a fellow preacher and used them to start a career as an itinerant priest. Moving from town to town, he started to build a reputation, not for being a great preacher, but for forcefully extracting donations or bequests from the dying. 2 years later, in 1865, he reached the town of Lagarde and befriended the priest, Mr. de Montien. Due to this friendship, he managed to become the vicar of the parish. Soon, the old priest who helped him is the target of an attempted poisoning. A strange liquid is found in the cruet used for the church mass. Sent for analysis, it's discovered that the liquid contains morphine. Of course, suspicion falls on priest Bude, but there is no investigation, as the older priest, Mr. Montien, refuses to complain to the police after discussing the situation with the bishop. In July of the same year, 1865, Bude travelled north and became the vicar in Viviers for Mr. Josserand. The poor man quickly realises that he has inherited a huge problem. The complaints against Bude are endless. Not only does the man steal, but he has a mistress to whom he offers a bed that he has stolen. 3 years later, in 1868, the troublesome priest is banished from Viviers and moved to Senargues. There, Bude takes mistresses, acts as a loan shark, commits forgeries, totally shameless. Again, the community revolts against the behaviour of the priest and Bude is moved to another township. By April 1871, he is sent to Turin and this time promoted to the role of parish priest. Now he has a whole parish to exact his crimes on, not just a village or a town. For the next 5 years, Bude carried on his transgressions and his behaviour got worse because he was sure of his impunity. We see this trait in many serial offenders throughout history. His actions became so misguided and erratic to such an extent that the bishop, Ernest Bourret, sent him a letter urging Bude to leave the parish and to resign. At this point, the justice was ready to indict him for forgeries he had created. The bishop also advises the priest to look for a teaching position and leave the priesthood. Bude, of course, refuses, believing that he is untouchable. In yet another letter, Bishop Bourret lists the different infractions that Bude is currently guilty of. Never opening his church's breviary, which is a liturgical book in the Roman Catholic Church that contains the daily service for the divine office, the official prayer of the church, consisting of psalms, readings and hymns that are recited at stated hours of the day. Stealing and embezzling money from the church. He has never been to confession and has no confessor himself. There has been a sexual assault against a young girl who is under 13 years old. Threats have been made towards his parishioners. Several instances of arson. Suspicion of attempted murder, which was not fully investigated previously, against Mr. de Montien. The most interesting is the fact that the infractions against the church and its liturgy top the list, while the crimes against the people are at the bottom, making the priorities of Bishop Bure quite apparent. Bure affirms, "I am not judging you. I do not want to lose you. On contrary, I want to save you." And he advised Boots to leave his position and find shelter in a religious house and take 1 or 2 years to rebuild his life. After 5 years as a parish priest, in March 1876, Bude is finally arrested for fraud. Bishop Bure contacts the Procurer of the Republic and assures him he will bar Bude from any ecclesiastical function for 3 months. He will also send him to a retreat as penitence. The bishop offers an explanation for the need to keep the dramatic story under wraps. These times are bad. The clergy is targeted by attacks, and sadly the spirit of the time tends to generalise and to allocate all of the faults. However, the investigation continues, and the list of complaints against the delinquent priest grows longer and longer. Once his 3 months penitence was achieved, Bude came back to Turin. But this time, his parishioners band together and refused to back down. At the end of church services, they wait for him, they boo and insult him. Bude flees the town and finds refuge within monks in a monastery in Ardèche. On the 28th of July 1876, he is finally captured and sent to jail. The accusations held against him at the time are forgeries and 2 sexual assaults on children under 13 years old. To avoid paying for his terrible crimes, Bude pretends to suffer from a form of madness. So, at the request of Bishop Bure, Bude is transferred to the prison of Montpellier to be examined by a doctor. Almost a year later, in June 1877, Bude is under the watchful eye of doctors until he recovers his senses and can be judged as a sane man. Because the priest has been sent to the Montpellier asylum, the investigation stopped right away. At this point, it seemed that Bude would escape the consequences of his actions, and the bishop can breathe a sigh of relief. That was until the Lantern newspaper published its findings and the investigation started all over again. After 7 years in a secure asylum, Bude is finally charged in August 1884. However, the man has more than one trick up his sleeve. 2 years after his sentencing, on the 1st of November 1886, he escaped from the asylum, assisted by 2 wardens and with some help from the outside. He then flees to Spain and then returned to France. While on the run, he hid in his own home in Aveyron, using a false identity. Not only that, but he returned to teaching. He was an accomplished conman. Bude is then hired by a rich widow as her right-hand man, her confidant. He convinces the old woman to sell him her property for a pittance in an attempt to subvert the inheritance law. The widow's daughter, enraged and suspicious at losing her inheritance of the house to this stranger, then makes inquiries. She manages to discover the real identity of her mother's employee. She immediately contacts the authorities, and Bude is rearrested on the 4th of September 1889, almost 3 years after his escape. The priest is returned to the Montpellier asylum and next to the Rodez prison. By the 19th of December 1889, the trial starts, with 70 witnesses appearing. Some of the sessions are held behind closed doors due to the awful nature of some of the crimes. 10 days later, Bude is convicted and condemned to life imprisonment and hard labour. His crimes are officially forgery, rape, and sexual assaults. When his appeal is rejected, he attempts to escape again in April 1890, but thankfully he fails. Around 18 months after being sentenced, on the 17th of May 1891, he arrives in the penal colony under the matricule registration number H2218. He manages to escape a few months later in October 1891, but this time he is quickly recaptured. Records state that he died in Guyana on the 8th of August 1906, aged 74. Unfortunately, for all this time, the murder of Mr. Albar remains unresolved, and the tribunal of Montpellier Asylum dismissed the charges against Bude in June 1890. Monsignor Ernest Buret, Bishop and Cardinal, 1827 to 1896. The attitude of Buret, the Bishop of Rodez, during the event is rather extraordinary. It starts from the day following the murder of Mr. Albar. Buret rushes to the crime scene, arriving before the procurer and the judge. He breaks the seals on the property under the pretext of recovering the keys of the church. He does everything to get the matter resolved as quickly as possible, with as little exposure as possible too. He presses the procurer and redirects the suspicions towards Julie Albar and the Serins family. He wrote to the priests of the region to keep their eyes open and to report any potential suspects to him and not to the authorities. Even the lantern is rather astonished by the bishop's behaviour. The story bears such an appearance of implausibility. In fact, Bishop Buret appears to take the lead to such an extent that all the procedure, at least at the beginning, had been directed by the bishop. The man is reputed to be a hardliner, uncompromising and stubborn. He is known to always be in conflict with the civil authorities, to whom he displays little respect. He had been a very vocal opponent to the government too. Being Bishop of Rodez since 1871, the post carried a lot of clout. It was based in one of the most wealthy and religious bishoprics of the country. He even helped out financially the Holy See following the loss of papal states. Bishop Buret was fiercely opposed to any intrusion of the government in church affairs. He eagerly defended the church prerogative when it came to the nomination of bishops and archbishops. He firmly believed religious congregation should be kept from outside influence, with their own laws and structures intact. In a letter, he elaborates on his reason to withstand any government intrusion in church affairs. It is precisely to defend the priests of this region that I had to oppose several times to the measures taken by the judiciary against them, when it was listening too sympathetically to the wrongs they have been accused of. When it comes to the crimes of priest Bude, Buret goes into overdrive to protect the priest. When the father of a young girl abused by Bude informs the bishop, no action is taken, and the man is convinced not to go to the authorities with his concerns. In May 1876, when Bude is arrested for forgery, Bishop Buret contacts the procurer and offers to have the priest punished by the ecclesiastical authorities rather than the civil ones. He also tries to convince Bude to leave the priesthood to stop the scandal escalating. In May 1874, in a letter we mentioned earlier, the bishop writes, "I don't judge. I don't want to lose you. On the contrary, I want to save you." Even previous to that, he had confessed to Bude's If ever priests have deserved the wrath of the church, you are one of them." So, the bishop knows exactly what kind of man this abominable priest is. After Boud's arrest in July 1876, Bouret writes again to the procurer and announces that the prisoner has lost his status and has been expelled from the priesthood. The publication of articles attacking the church and denouncing its crimes so freely is the result of a recent development in the story of the press. This paves the way for the current freedoms we see in the media today, almost 150 years later. After the French Revolution, the different governments had approaches towards the published word that wavered between full censorship and freedom with some restrictions. Jules de Polignac, minister of Charles X, summarised the position of the different regimes. "It would be to deny the obvious, not to see the newspapers as the main source of calamities threatening the kingdom. No force, we must admit, is able to resist a solvent as energetic as the press." Louis XVIII had provided the press with freedom, but with some limitations. His brother, Charles X, in an attempt to reaffirm the royal power, issued 4 ordinances on the 26th of July, 1830. One of them is the re-establishment of the press censorship. He declared that no newspaper should be published without authorization of the king. In reaction to this, numerous newspapers and journalists disobeyed. They were one of the driving forces behind the July Revolution, also known as the 3 Glorious Days. Charles X abdicated and fled the country. After this, slowly, the control over the press loosened up. 3 decades later, in 1868, any newspaper could be created without the need of approval of the authorities, let alone the monarchy. Finally, the Law of July 1881 provided the foundation set in stone for the freedom of press and of expression. At the moment of the vote, only 4 voices dissented. This law had its opponents, who were found within the rank of the Conservatives and the protectors of moral order. Le Croix, a Catholic newspaper, stated, "The press cannot be free, and the title is a lie. All that has a social character must be regulated for the good of the society. Revolutionaries are, moreover, incapable of granting freedom, since, as we say elsewhere, they necessarily result in the exaggeration of rights of the state, and in the collectivism to which they tend, all individual freedom is suppressed in favour of delegates." From that moment, any newspaper could be created without authorization or the payment of a caution, which was money paid in advance to guarantee the payment of fines for printing information that was deemed incorrect, slanderous, or defamatory. The journalist's sources are also protected now, meaning that people would be more willing to come forward with information. In brief, anyone could set up shop and publish a newspaper to defend and propagate their ideas. This led to an explosion of new titles and the development of strategies to attract a readership, much as we see in tabloid newspapers and websites today. Created in 1877 by Henry Rochefort, you may recognise the name from our video on famous graves and a deadly duel, Le Lantern was popular due to different factors: low prices, publication of serial stories, and its blatant anti-clericalism. Its success also came from some of its bold actions, like articles criticising the Parisian police, a campaign attacking the management of asylums, and of course, the uncovering of church scandals. Among its collaborators were famous authors Émile Zola and Guy de Maupassant, as well as statesman Aristide Briand. The competition between the emerging newspapers was fierce, leading some to protect their sensational scoops. Le Lanterne sued La Dépêche de Toulouse. The latter reproduced the articles concerning Bude without authorization, which caused much upset. The reason given by La Dépêche was that because the articles were simply news, they can be replicated and inserted in any newspaper. For Le Lanterne, the articles being based on an investigation which they undertook and documented means that they remained a literary work and are therefore protected by copyright. You see, the Dépêche newspaper benefited greatly from the stolen work as its circulation and readership increased. Le Lanterne won the court case, and subsequently, at the end of each article about the investigation of the priest, a sentence appeared. Reproduction prohibited without special permission. This victory, however, added to the feeling of vindication from the Catholic press, absolving the priest. If the Lanterne confessed the articles are a literary work, then they spring from an imaginative and malignant mind bound to hurt the innocent. You could not be sure how much of their writing was fiction and how much was fact. But the Lanterne never hid its blatant anti-clericalism and republicanism. Like other newspapers of the time, politicians and artists, it supported a separation between the church and the state and attacked an institution that had influenced and dominated France for centuries. Anti-clericalism is based on three assumptions over the church, assumptions which are clearly stated when reading the articles from Le Lanterne newspaper. Number 1. The church is not a corporation like any other. It is a world apart with its own rules, laws and rituals. For example, Bishop Buret in a letter offers to punish Bude by making him do penance instead of sending him in front of a judge, a proposal that he believes to be fair. Number 2. The church is a threat against the state, which explains the popularity of Gallicanism to make the French church autonomous from the papal power in Rome, a threat against a nation, religious orders or clerics answer to an outside power, a threat against the individual and the family due to the control over beliefs and behaviours. And number 3, the clerics are not necessarily following the teaching of the church. Well, the behaviour of priest Bude speaks for itself. He was clearly using his position of trust for his own gain and not asserting Christian values. But did you know that even the deceased Mr. Alba, the victim, is not exempt from this, as he was a usurer, a person who lends money at unreasonably high rates of interest, like a loan shark. Some of the stolen money was the product of these transactions. One of the reasons given to explain the murder was that priest Bude desperately needed finances to buy a property, and Mr. Alba refused to lend it to him. In the 19th century, slowly, an anti-clerical rhetoric developed. This was focused around the image of the lecherous, sinful, criminal priest and the denunciation of the clerical hypocrisy. The title of this podcast, Monster in a Cassock, actually becomes popular in the anti-clerical press from the time, in which the priest becomes an object of disgust, a sexual pervert, a criminal. The word church itself gains a pejorative connotation in the anti-clerical crowd. To them, the institution appears to be backward, reactionary, and following its own teachings and doctrines just for the good of itself, not its congregation. As you well know, this is not a new argument. In the past, those preaching Catharism and Waldensianism expressed their dismay towards a church not living according to its own standards. If previously the church had been able to winter those attacks, in the 19th century, things have definitely changed. It is no longer possible to imprison and execute those who oppose the church's power, as they are actually being elected and are part of the government. Bood's case is one of the numerous church scandals peppering the 19th century and beyond. The new freedoms given to the press allowed a public newspaper to uncover a series of horrendous crimes, a cover-up by the church, and to act as a whistleblower, drawing attention to the situation. Most importantly, they get the man to pay for his crimes without the protection of the church. While the reasons behind Le Lantern publishing this story were not entirely altruist, the newspaper got justice for the victims in the end. It's a pity it took 20 years to reach this outcome, and that Mr. Albar's murder remains unsolved. However, the spotlight on the Catholic Church has not dimmed, and is sure to illuminate the crimes of some of its members for years to come.